we have seen, animals are full of fun and surprises, and this particular lecture is on a specific group of invertebrates. Recall that in our last lecture, we looked at organisms called non-bilaterians, or animals called non-bilaterians, referring to animals that do not have bilateral symmetry. So we looked at sponges, which were asymmetrical. We looked at cnidarians and ctenophores, which are radially symmetrical. So today we're going to be exploring our first group of bilaterians, of organisms or animals that have bilateral symmetry. And we're going to look at a specific group of bilaterally symmetrical animals known as the Lophotrochozoans. And I know that's a big, weird word. We will define it. But the Lophotrochozoans are meant to represent a monophyletic group of invertebrate animals. So this is going to include a few different phyla, some of which are my favorite ever, like the mollusks. So before we jump into the specific phyla, let's begin with an introduction on the bilaterians, right? These are animals that have bilateral symmetry. They have a single plane where you can divide the animal and have a symmetric side on either end. And to recall that these are going to be animals that not only have a front and a back, so an anterior and a posterior end, they're going to also have a dorsal and a ventral side, right? So a back and a belly, and they will also have a left and a right side. So these are basically animals where you can think about more complex orientation and body plans. Now, what makes a bilaterian so is the fact that they have something called the process of cephalization. And you may be familiar with the prefix cephalo. We are actually going to see it later on in this lecture as well, but cephalo means head. It literally means head, like the thing that sits on your shoulders, right? So cephalization is literally the formation of a head. And remember that the cnidarians don't have heads, sponges don't have heads, but these bilaterian animals do indeed have heads. And, you know, we kind of take that for granted, having a head. Animals have heads. But why? Why a head, right? Like, why this process of cephalization, and what are the evolutionary advantages of having a head? Well, if you think about what a head is, it's going to be a concentration of specific anatomical features at the anterior end of the body, right? So we're looking at things like a mouth is usually going to be positioned at the head. Not all, but most animals have a mouth positioned at the head. Ganglia, this means like bundles of nervous tissue, and in more complex animals, of course, this means a brain. Sense organs, which of course are part of that nervous system, part of that brain, which is sending stimulus signals or environmental signals in various ways to that brain. So we're going to have a concentration of sense organs near the head, things like eyes, right, which are collecting information about light and visual information from the environment. We're going to have chemical sensors near the head, which are usually going to be responsible for smell or taste or other types of sensing chemicals in the environment. And sometimes tactile as well, tactile sensors. So bilaterian animals are going to have a head. They've got cephalization. And, you know, if you also think about the advantages of this as far as movement goes, remember animals are movers. If you have a head, then there's more intentionality in the movement because you're encountering your environment with the anterior end of your body. This is the part of your body that's basically coming into contact with the environment first if you're moving in a particular direction, right? So if you think about a fish, for example, that fish has all of those sense organs on the anterior end of its body, and it's encountering its environment as it moves and collecting that information, passing it along to the brain and reacting to the stimuli in the environment. So for animals that move intentionally, having a head is very advantageous. And it was clearly a successful trait to have because all animals basically, beyond the evolution of the first bilaterally symmetrical animals, have a head, with few exceptions, of course. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Let me know if you have questions about that. And here in this image, we can see, you know, that classic tube within a tube structure that I was talking about last time, where the inner tube is the gut, we've got the body wall as the outer tube, and there are several types of muscles that are going to facilitate movement in these bilaterally symmetrical animals, you know, circular muscles or longitudinal muscles. All right. So when it comes to the bilaterians, or the bilaterally symmetrical animals, remember that we've got two major groups, and these groups are determined by early stages of embryogenesis. We talked about protostomes versus deuterostomes in the first lecture, recall. And protostomes are going to be a wide variety of invertebrates. Remember that first opening in the endoderm that eventually becomes the gut, that first blastopore is going to be the mouth. And so we call these guys protostomes, first mouth. And the protostomes are represented by these major phyla of animals. And so we're going to be exploring the protostomes first. We're going to have two lectures on protostomes. This is the first one that looks at the Lophotrochozoa. And then we have one after this, which looks at this second group here, the Ecdysozoa. So for today, we're going to be focusing on this first group shown in purple, the Lophotrochozoa, including the rotifers, the Platyhelminthes, the Annelida, and the mollusca. Please note that today we won't be looking at the rotifers in lecture, but we will have a chance to check out some live rotifers in lab. So for lecture, we won't be covering the rotifers, just these three phyla. Okay, so let's talk about these Lophotrochozoans, right? This is the first major group of protostomes, and yeah, it's a good idea to kind of keep track of these names, even though they're kind of technical and complex. These names are important because they are names of monophyletic groups. And we talked about how early on in the evolution lessons that we had, how we really want to try to organize organisms in the natural world according to their evolutionary relationships and therefore their phylogenies. So the word or the name Lophotrochozoa is definitely meaningful. It's phylogenetically meaningful. It refers to a specific clade of animals. And it refers to two specific anatomical features that annoyingly aren't actually found in every single type of Lophotrochozoan, but are found in some of them. And so this name just is kind of what stuck. Okay, so if we look at the word Lophotrochozoa, we can, right off the bat, we can see this right here, zoa. Always remember that that means animal, right? Zoo, like the zoo, right? You go to the zoo to see animals. So zoa is always going to mean animal. And then we've got those other two pieces of this word. We've got lopho and we've got trocho. Okay, so lopho is going to refer to this right here, something called a lophophore. And a lophophore is a feeding structure, a structure that is found in some Lophotrochozoans used for suspension feeding in the adults. And suspension feeding is basically a strategy for pulling particles out of the water. And here's a look at what a lophophore looks like. It's basically this little kind of feather-like structure that is exerted from the body of the animal. And these little feather-like structures, the lophophores, help to collect food particles in the water. So this is definitely found in aquatic animals, mostly marine animals that are suspension feeding, pulling these particles out of the water. And you can see the gut here, right? So it pulls, and then they can usually pull the lophophore in and then let it out again, pull it in, let it out again. Okay, so that's the lopho part. And then the trocho part has to do with this right here. This is called a trochophore. And a trochophore is a type of larva that is seen in some Lophotrochozoans. And this larva is particularly unique because it has a little ring of cilia around the circumference of its body. So these, you can see these, it says here, cilia. Cilia, remember, are always going to be little hair-like projections like the ciliates that we learned about way long ago. They are these little hair-like projections, and they're going to undulate them, and that allows these animals to move around their aqueous environment, okay? So the Lophotrochozoans are animals that have either a lophophore or a trochophore, but then there are some that don't have these. So I didn't make up the rules. This is just the name that they've given it, okay? Any questions about that? Cool. All right, so as I mentioned, the Lophotrochozoan lecture is going to include some specific animal phyla, and just like in our previous animal lecture, we are going to explore these animals phylum by phylum, and each phylum we're going to discuss the specific characteristics of the animals in that phylum. We're going to look at body symmetry, you know, body cavities, what else did we do? Tissue layers, and then some of the unique characteristics associated with each of these phyla. And in this little box here, I'm showing you the specific phyla that we'll be covering in this lesson. We're going to look at the phylum Platyhelminthes. These are our flatworms, as you'll see. And then the flatworms are going to have 4 different classes that we'll learn about, and they're shown here, and we'll go through each of these in more detail. Then we've got the phylum Annelida, which are going to be our segmented worms. And that includes 3 classes that we'll learn about, or no, I'm sorry, 2 classes. I can't get my numbers right today. The Polychaeta and the Clytellata. And then my favorite, which is the phylum Mollusca. And you know, the mollusca is just mollusks, so there's no like real informal name to put here. But this is an incredibly diverse group of animals, diverse in terms of number of species, but also diverse morphologically, ecologically, and it contains some of my favorite cephalopods, which maybe you guys already have a little bit of a love for. If you don't, I'm going to convince you why you should love cephalopods. Now, we're only looking at these guys here. Keep in mind, however, that these are not all of the Lophotrochozoans that exist on the planet. There are several other Lophotrochozoan phyla that we're just not going to cover. We don't have time to cover all of the animal phyla. And you're probably thinking like, yes, okay. But they include the Rotifera, which we'll cover in lab, and then these kind of lesser known phyla like Sipuncula, Phoronida, etc. Okay, so we will not be covering these. You'll see that there's a table in your textbook that describes them a little bit. All right. So we're going to begin with the phylum Platyhelminthes, and the phylum Platyhelminthes is composed of animals commonly known as flatworms, and flatworm is an appropriate name for these guys because they tend to have flattened bodies. Now, remember, we are now looking at bilaterian animals, so the body symmetry of these guys is bilateral. These animals also have 3 tissue layers, so let me just say that every single animal phylum from here on out is going to be triploblastic. That's kind of a nice pattern to remember in your head, that the bilaterally symmetrical animals are also the triploblastic animals. This is an animal phylum that is represented by the acoelomates. These guys do not have a true body cavity. They completely lack a body cavity. And I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, that this is the only animal phylum we'll cover in this class that does not have a body cavity, okay? Now, one of the interesting aspects of the flatworms is that they actually have an incomplete gut, kind of like how we saw with the jellyfish and the cnidarians. They've only got one opening into their gut. And that's what makes these guys a little bit different. You know, we're used to bilaterally symmetrical animals having an opening in the mouth and then an opening at the anus, and like food goes in one direction, but the flatworms don't. They have a blind gut where food goes in one hole and it comes out the same hole. So they have an incomplete gut, and we'll look at that in a second. Obviously, they have cephalization because they're bilaterally symmetrical animals, but think about these guys as being some of the most ancient ancient lineages of the bilaterally symmetrical animals. So some, you know, thinking about evolutionary scientists, they believe perhaps cephalization is a trait that may have originated in one of these early lineages like the flatworms. Now, they are very simple animals, so they're going to lack sophisticated organ systems for gas exchange, for circulation, even for reproduction. So they rely on high surface area to volume ratios for efficient diffusion of resources. Hence, the flatworm thing, okay? They're really flat. Flat means lots of surface area. They can diffuse oxygen directly through their body wall. They can diffuse nutrients to each of their cells in a more efficient way if they have good surface area. So they don't have, you know, a closed circulatory system. They don't have like gills or anything like that. They're just diffusing stuff from cell to cell. Remember diffusion back in 210A? This is a relatively inefficient process for moving materials around an organism, for moving them around a biological system, okay? So that's one of the things that's important to know here. Now, as far as flatworm classification goes, we've got 4 different classes. And the first one is the Turbellaria, and this is our only, well, actually I have it written there. It's our only free living group of flatworms, meaning that they do not depend on a host. These 3 groups down here are all parasitic, and I think I have it written there in the notes, but just to emphasize that, okay? So the Turbellaria are gonna be like this guy right here, and some of them are actually quite pretty. There's a lot of species of marine flatworms that are free living. They kind of just, you know, swim around their environment. They eat food here and there. But these 3 groups, the Monogenea, the Trematoda, and the Cestota, are all different types of parasitic flatworms. And we're gonna go through each of these classes as well. Before we do, let me just point out some important features. The Monogeneans are gonna be oftentimes external parasites, and they have a single host. The trematodes tend to be endoparasites and have very complex multi-host life cycles. And then the cestode are also internal parasites that tend to parasitize the guts of animals like mammals, okay, think tapeworms. All right, now let's look to begin at the class Turbellaria, which are our free living flatworms. These are going to be flatworms that you might find swimming around in a creek. In fact, when I go and collect creek water for, you know, my microscopy stuff, I oftentimes find several different types of free living Turbellarian flatworms. And notice that these guys have a lot of the features that you would expect to see on a typical animal. For example, eye spots that allow them to collect information visually or about the light in their environment. So they can tell if it's dark, they can tell if it's light. They can't form complex images like more sophisticated animals can, but they can basically tell the light levels in their environment. And they oftentimes will seek out dark places to find cover and avoid predators. They also, and I don't remember if I have, no, I don't. Okay, hold on. They also have these chemical sensors called auricles. So eye spots are gonna sense light, obviously. The auricles are gonna be chemical sensors. And that's these little guys right here. These are the auricles. Okay, they almost look like little, I don't know, little ears on the side of their head. And they can use that to sense, you know, oh, where's some food, or I sense a mate, or I sense, you know, whatever it is, anything that's got a chemical component to their environment, they can sense that with those auricles. And then you can also see their incomplete gut kind of. This thing right here is called a pharynx. And the pharynx, you can think of it as like a protuberance that comes out of the middle of its body. So its mouth is actually like halfway down its body on the ventral side, which is weird. Like imagine you had a mouth coming out of your belly button or something. And that's kind of how their anatomy works. They don't have a mouth up here at the head. Their mouth is this pharynx thing, okay? And so they will extend their pharynx and they'll eat stuff from their environment and then pull it in to their incomplete gut that goes into a gastrovascular cavity. So just, you know, imagine a blind gut, right? It doesn't have another opening. They digest their food, they diffuse those nutrients to all parts of the body. You can actually see how there are these structures inside that facilitate the movement of nutrients throughout the body. And then they'll basically poop it out the same hole that they ate it from. I know, it sounds really gross, right? But that's how it works in flatworms. All right, so that's kind of general flatworm anatomy, and the reason we're using the turbularians is because they are free living, and so they're easier to observe, and they're going to kind of have a lifestyle that's a little bit more understandable because they're consuming things from their environment rather than a host. I know, Victor, ew, it's pretty gross. All right, another fascinating aspect of flatworms is their reproductive strategies, and I've got a little GIF here, and I'm gonna show you the video of this in just a minute. Flatworms do undergo sexual reproduction, although you can cut a piece of a flatworm off and it will regenerate into a new flatworm, which is a form of asexual reproduction. Which is also fascinating. But the thing to think about and keep in mind for most flatworms is that at least the turbularians are hermaphroditic. So they're going to have both male and female structures on the same worm. So that means they produce sperm and they produce egg in the same body. Now, remember what I told you guys, flatworms are very simple animals. They don't have these complex reproductive systems with, like, you know, a series of tubes that help to, for example, you know, deposit sperm into the female reproductive tract like we're used to. But they don't have that, but they do form these sperm and egg. And so how do they have sex, basically? Well, some species of flatworm, like the turbularians, undergo something called hypodermic insemination. So if you were to interpret this, we're saying below the skin, so insemination below the skin. And this is manifested in this fascinating behavior called penis fencing, where basically two hermaphroditic flatworms try to stab each other with their penises and inseminate each other through their body wall. I told you animals were interesting. And that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing a couple of flatworms trying to stab each other and inseminate each other for reproduction. Now, why is this a fight? Like, why are they fighting each other and trying to stab each other to inject sperm? Well, for this answer, we have to think all the way back to our evolution lecture and remember the asymmetry of sex, right? The asymmetrical investment in male versus female reproductive success, right? So to be female is generally more costly. It requires more investment in eggs, in developing young, etc. So it's to the worm's advantage to actually take the male role. And so what they're doing is they're actually like fighting over who gets to be male. So I'm going to show you guys a video that shows this. So hang tight for a sec. Let me just switch on over. It's kind of a small picture. Can you guys see this okay? Yeah, okay. There we go.
Flatworms have both male and female sex organs. But when it comes time to make little flatworms, they have to decide who plays which role. And that they fight over. The two flatworms rear up, exposing their midsections. Those jutting white nibs aren't weapons, at least not intentional ones. They are actually the worm's penises, a double-barreled inseminator, if they can shoot first. Flatworm sex consists of the two attempting to stab their lover with their pointed pair and inseminate each other, an act delicately referred to as penis fencing. But there's nothing delicate about it. Flatworms have been known to gouge holes in each other in battles lasting up to an hour. Why do they cross swords? Producing offspring requires a lot of energy. The winning father can go out and about in the world without any further responsibility. The losing mother absorbs the winner's sperm. It must now work longer and harder to find food and stay alive. The father floats merrily along.
La-di-da.
The mother crawls along looking for a meal. already the responsible one.
It's tough, man. Tough life. Okay. I'm gonna go back to my.
Wait, can they inseminate them like at the same time, like both of them?
You know, that's definitely, that could be an option, I suppose. I don't know. Oh, so Danielle's asking the same thing. I would assume so. And like, I guess it makes sense to be able to have both, like, you know, like have both female and male reproductive success, right? To be able to have both of those would seem to be even more advantageous than just acting as one parent or the other. But perhaps, you know, in this particular species or several types of species, there is more of a cost associated with the female aspect. I think, you know, you have to think about the fact also that they're like being wounded. So maybe there is some energy investment in taking the sperm as well as, you know, developing the offspring as a female. So perhaps there's like this hierarchy of evolutionary payoffs where to be male is going to be like the best option. To be female is going to be the second best, and then to not have either is going to be the worst, obviously. So, and Kelsey's asking about inseminating themselves. So if you inseminate yourself, first of all, I don't know that an animal would do that, like to be able to stab itself to inseminate itself. But remember, it all goes back to genetic diversity. So even if you're a hermaphrodite, there is evolutionary advantage to cross-fertilization, even if you can self-fertilize, right? So I would say that would probably be the most logical answer for why they wouldn't fertilize themselves like a plant would. There's inbreeding, right? The ultimate inbreeding. Yeah, good questions, guys. Any others before we move on? Sounds good. So we're going to move on to the next class of the flatworms. So the phylum Platyhelminthes. And by the way, I forgot to tell you guys that Platyhelminthes literally means flatworm, right? Platy means flat, helminth means worm. So if you look at that phylum name, which I promised we were going to dissect them all and I just forgot, platy, flat, helminth means worm. And so you can see it right there in the phylum name. Okay, so this class of flatworms is the class Monogenea. This is a group of parasitic flatworms. They are ectoparasites. Again, looking at this etymology, remember that ecto means outside. So ectoparasites are going to be parasites that attach usually to the outside of the animal's body, to the host's body. And in this case, the monogeneans are oftentimes ectoparasites of fish. And in this fish, we can see that there are these little monogenean worms attached to its gills. And they're basically just sucking off the fluid and I would assume the blood of that fish. These parasites tend to be a big problem in aquaculture. So think about fish that are being farmed in concentrated places. When we have a high concentration of fish like salmon or tilapia or whatever, they tend to get more of these parasites because there's such a high concentration of hosts there. These monogeneans are also hermaphroditic, like we saw in the turbolarians. We have another class of parasitic flatworms, and they're known as trematodes. And the trematodes, rather than being ectoparasites, they are endoparasites. Remember, endo means inside. So they're going to be parasitizing the inside of their host's body. In contrast to the monogeneans, the trematodes have quite complex life cycles with multiple hosts. And nearly all trematodes are parasites of mollusks and vertebrates. So they have an intermediate host, which is usually a mollusk, and then a definitive host, which is some kind of a vertebrate. Their life cycles usually contain a pretty large variation in body forms throughout the life cycle. So sometimes they're going to have body forms that actually change in shape, and they have different names associated with them. And there are many types of trematodes that do in fact infect humans, particularly in developing countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. This right here is a picture of the Chinese liver fluke. This is a human parasite. It parasitizes the liver of its human hosts, and it can be acquired by eating undercooked meat. Again, not a big issue so much here in North America, but in some of the developing areas of the world, it is something that you can definitely get. One of the most common types of human pathogens that belong to this group is in the worm called schistosoma. So this is schistosoma here. Schistosoma. It's just a drawing of it. You can find pictures of them online, but I liked the drawing because it shows its anatomy a little bit better. When we look at the lab, we're going to see some actual microscope images of them. So this is a trematode that causes the illness known as schistosomiasis. If you're from a part of the world where this is common, you may have recognized this. It's endemic in 74 countries. Where greater than 80% of infected people are found in sub-Saharan Africa. There are 600 million people at risk of schistosomiasis and about 200 million infected. Common disease in humans after malaria. And this is probably an organism you've never heard of. So when somebody has schistosomiasis, and I just got a little thing that said my internet is unstable, so let me know if you can't hear me or something happens. So when somebody gets infected with schistosomiasis, there are symptoms such as abdominal pain, diarrhea, blood in the urine, and this is an illness that takes quite a long time to progress and develop. And so if it's not treated early, it can lead to things like kidney failure, liver disease, bladder cancer, and other conditions. And again, if we look at these numbers, this is a very common disease. I just noticed that Danielle had asked a question in the chat box, so let me get to that. Could these be parasitic to humans if we ingested a fish? Yeah, no, they're not. So remember that the monogeneans are actually ectoparasites on fish gills. So they're specifically adapted to living off of fish gills. And since we don't have fish gills, it wouldn't matter to us. And we'd probably just eat them. But they are damaging to the fish, just not to us. But, it could be to us if we're farming fish, right? So it's still something that could certainly affect human livelihoods. Okay, so let's take a look at the life cycle of schistosoma. This is going to be one of the examples of life cycles where we can see multiple hosts being involved, where the human is the definitive host and a snail is the intermediate host. And the reason that this is a common disease in developing countries is because it's something that is oftentimes found in places with poor sanitation and poor infrastructure. So the way that this happens is we'll have a human host comes to a body of water. They might drink from that body of water, but this might be a body of water that is also used for urination and defecation. And so it's going to be contaminated with, the excrement of individuals. And so if somebody comes along and they drink this water, they can acquire the disease that way, but you don't even have to drink the water because the adult, I guess they're not adults, one of the stages of the schistosoma is this cercaria here, and this little animal will burrow into the skin of the adult who is wading in the water. So this individual might have these cercaria maybe burrow in through the toes or the feet, and once they get into the skin, they will develop into adults, and those adults will then release eggs into the body, and those eggs will come out of the human's body when they urinate and defecate. Once the eggs are in the water, they will hatch, and they will hatch because a snail actually consumes them. So we've got these eggs in the water, snails are going along, they're consuming these eggs, and then in the snail body, hold on, snails become infected when larvae from the eggs penetrate the snail. That's right. Okay, so the larvae are penetrating the snail, and then the snail will shed these cercaria once they've developed in the snail's body, and then the cercaria will be free swimming in the water, and then they'll go and burrow into a new human. Okay, so I didn't explain that great, but the cercaria burrow into the human, the cercaria develop into adults, the adults shed eggs in the human body, the human excretes the eggs into the water, the eggs hatch into larvae, and then those larvae will get taken up by snails. Inside the snail body, those larvae develop into the cercaria and then get shed into the water and kind of close this whole loop again. Okay. All right, Andrew is asking about hookworms. Hookworms are, gosh, I used to have hookworms here. Let me just fact check that real quick. Hookworms are, no, hookworms are not flatworms. Hookworms are nematode worms. So they are different. They're in a completely different animal phylum, the phylum Nematoda. So we will get to that. And I do think I talk about them in the nematode lesson. Okay, any questions about schistosoma, by the way? All right, okay. Now, one more thing I wanted to point out, the schistosome worms are actually not hermaphrodites. There are males and females. And if we go back to this slide, this is the male and this is the female. Well, we're gonna look at this more in lab, but the male, I always remember, it kind of looks like a hot dog bun, and the female looks like a hot dog in the hot dog bun. I don't know if that's weird or like awkward, but that's how I remember it. So the female will kind of like permanently, what's the word, like dock into the male body. It's got this groove here, and then they'll just kind of like permanently be in copula, which means like they're just constantly copulating and producing these eggs and these fertilized eggs and these different offspring. Yeah. Danielle's asking, just to clarify, schistosome is the organism, schistosomiasis is the disease. Correct, that's exactly right. So schistosoma is the genus, and there's different species of schistosoma, and schistosomiasis is the disease caused by the infection of these worms in the human body. Okay. This is not my area of expertise, by the way, as you can tell. This is something I've had to learn along the way. Okay, so that was the third class of the flatworms, and then we have one more class of flatworms, which is the class Cestota, and the Cestota are represented by tapeworms. So this is the informal name for these guys. Tapeworms are also endoparasites, so internal parasites, and their hosts are commonly vertebrates. And as you may know, humans can certainly be hosts to tapeworms. They have on the anterior end of their body a special structure called a scolex. And the scolex is basically all these little hooks here. Those hooks are meant to burrow into the intestinal lining of the host. And then behind the scolex, or you can kind of imagine this as being the head, it's going to have a series of segments called proglottids. And again, we'll see this in lab a little more. These proglottids are involved in reproduction. They're hermaphroditic, and these proglottids will each have both sperm and egg producing structures where they can shed eggs, they can make sexually reproductive offspring, and as they continue to grow inside of their host, they can add more and more segments of these proglottids to the terminal end or to the posterior end of the animal's body. How long can they get? I don't know. Pretty long. I think they can get to be several feet long, as kind of going by the pictures I've seen on the internet. Yeah, I know. Pretty gross, right? Yeah. And I think that a lot of times you don't even know you have them. They're just kind of there, like sharing your food with you. Gross. Yeah. Okay. Parasites are fascinating. We're going to have a whole talk about parasites later on in the semester. Okay, so that's it for the phylum Platyhelminthes. We are now going to get into our second phylum of the day, which is the phylum Annelida. And the annelids are our segmented worms, segmented. And this is important because this is going to be how we remember these different kinds of animals. So these guys are going to be bilaterally symmetrical. They are triploblastic. And they are also different from our flatworms because they are true coelomates. So they have a true body cavity that is completely lined in mesoderm. And they also have, and I didn't write it here, but we might want to just make note of it, they do have a complete gut, unlike the flatworms. So they're going to have a full tube, right, where food goes in one end and comes out the other. And their unique characteristics include their segmentation, which is technically called metamerism and metamerism, and that refers to a repetition of body parts. So a repetition of muscles, nerves, appendages, etc. Now we're going to see that there are other animal phyla that have segmented bodies, but the segmentation in those bodies are a bit different, or is a bit different from the segmentation in these annelid worms. So you can see by looking at this polychaete worm here that there's a head, but then there's like this repetition of all the same kind of repeating body parts or kind of units of the body that include these, they're called parapodia, and different muscle tissues and stuff, okay? Now, I'm also including this image here, which I really like. This is from a previous textbook that I used to teach a similar class, but I like it because it shows us some of the fundamental anatomical differences between an annelid worm and a flatworm. So for the flatworm, we can see this very simple body. It doesn't have any segmentation. And if you look at its gut, right, food is going to go in through this one opening and out the same opening. So it's got that blind gut. If you compare the longitudinal section now to the annelid worm, we can see not only the metamerism, but also the fact that it's got a complete tube within a tube structure. So you can have that complete gut there. It also shows a cross section of these worms. And in the flatworm, notice that we have no body cavity, right? We simply have this black representing the connective tissue or the mesoderm that's filling in the space between the body wall and the gut. Compared to the annelid worm that has a body wall and a gut, but it also has that body cavity. So this space right here is the body cavity, or the coelom, right? And that's something that we're not seeing over here in the flatworm. And the black, again, representing the mesoderm completely lining that body cavity. All right, cool. So let's take a look at some annelid diversity. The annelid phylum is one of these phyla that has really been in flux in terms of phylogeny and taxonomy. So depending on what your source is, you may see that the annelid worms have a different number of classes. This, from my own research, seems to be the most up-to-date way of looking at annelid taxonomy. We've got two classes, the class Polychaeta, and Polychaeta literally means many bristles. So poly, you guys know, means many. Chaetae are the specific bristles found on these worms. And these are bristle worms. Oh, I'm missing an R there. Don't mind my typo. And then the second class is the class Clytolata, which includes two lineages, the Oligochaeta, which literally means few bristles and includes earthworms and other related animals, and the Hierodonida, which includes the leeches. One of the things that has changed in the past taxonomically is that the Oligochaeta used to be considered its own class, And that is what has changed recently. So we're gonna go, even though you're gonna see different, maybe even in your photographic atlas, it might show it a little bit different. Make sure that you are using the taxonomy that I'm referring to here in lecture. Okay, so these are 3 examples of annelid worms. This is a Christmas tree worm, which is a kind of polychaete worm. This is a leech, and this is an earthworm. So let's start out by looking at the class Polychaeta. The class Polychaeta is the largest of all the annelids. We tend to find polychaete worms mostly in marine ecosystems. They are very common in the sediment. They are common, like the Christmas tree worms I just showed you, they grow in the actual corals, and they have these cute little colorful Christmas tree-like structures. The polychaete worms have well-differentiated heads with specialized sense organs. So you can kind of see on this guy right here, it's got kind of like these tentacle-like things that it uses to sense stuff. Some of them have eyes and other structures that they use to sense their environment. The polychaete worms also have special structures called parapodia, which are paired paddle-like appendages, and you can see them here. So like these little guys right here, these are the parapodia. And the parapodia give rise to bristles, hence the name Polychaeta, right? Many bristles. So if you look really closely, you can see that these parapodia kind of give rise to these little bristle-like structures if you were to zoom in there, okay? So those are the polychaete worms. Additionally, these guys oftentimes are dioecious, so they have separate sexes, unlike many of the flatworms that we looked at, and also unlike some of the other types of annelids, which we'll see in just a minute. Okay, so those are the polychaete worms. My favorite polychaete worm is the bobbit worm. This is the bobbit worm, Unis aphroditois. And the bobbit worm is, let me, I can't see my notes, so I have some pretty astounding statistics. I kind of like that I have 2 computers now. Bobbit worms are crazy, scary polychaete worms. They can grow up to 10 feet long. 10 feet, that's 3 meters. Imagine one of these 10 feet long, okay? They've got these crazy mandibles. These are like jaws, okay? And what they do is they'll hang out in the sand, in the sediment, so they're like under the sand, and they use these little guys here, these 3 little antennae-like things, and they kind of like twitch them in the water just above the sand to lure fish to them. And then when a fish comes by, it goes out of the water and it like snaps them with these crazy jaws that they have. So imagine a 10-foot one of these. Yeah, that could get a scuba diver for sure, I think. And then it pulls it underground into its underground burrow. Yeah, so you guys are aliens from, yeah, it looks like Alien. I will show a video. See, I was looking for videos and there was one that I found, but it was kind of inappropriate because if you guys seen, there's like these nature videos where the guy like narrates it and it's hilarious, but there's a lot of kind of inappropriate language. So here, let me see what I can find for you guys. Bobbit. Because why not, right? Bobbit. I did used to show one worm video. Okay, we're just totally like improvising here, so maybe we'll get something good, maybe we won't. My internet wants to work. Okay, here's one. About this, the sinister bobbit worm. Sinistre. Oh, how about this? Okay, this says...
Right this moment, there is a mad rush in America.
Sorry.
Apple,
Okay.
Amazon, Facebook, dozens more. They're all betting on a radical new technology. Deep on the ocean floor, the sand striker,
Yeah,
or bobbit worm, waits, with multiple mouth parts displayed.
Can you guys see that?
Bone-hard grappling hooks, poised to pierce and immobilize prey. But the real nightmare remains unseen. Coiled, pent-up aggression as long as an arm. And some specimens grow to twice the length of a man. As night falls, many sand strikers emerge to feast.
So dramatic.
It's a bad neighborhood to hang out in.
Can't with this narration, it's ridiculous.
But fish are fast, and the sand strikers are feeding blind. They don't have eyes or a brain. They react only if one of their antennae is triggered or if a shadow lingers. Patience. Gotcha. And the sand strikers are just getting started.
Okay, I'm gonna stop it there because we have to get back to the lesson. But there you go. Now, who's gonna be a bobbit worm for Halloween?
Those jaws are insane. When they slowly retract out, it just looks super creepy.
Ooh, they're creepy. And fun fact, guys, the bobbit worm is named after Lorena Bobbitt. And if you know who that is, you'll understand why. And if you don't know who that is, go ahead and do a Google search because I'm not sure I want to explain that one. Okay. Okay, so that's the bobbit worm, probably the craziest polychaete worm in the world. All right, guys, so moving on. I know that was exciting. We'll have some more exciting stuff in just a minute. Okay. Never going into the ocean again. I don't think they live here in California, so I think you'll be okay. I think I saw like Indonesia, like Southeast Asia, so maybe just stay out of the water there.
So can I just ask a question? So
yeah.
Bobbit, I mean, like that was like in the 90s or something, but like, did it have a different name before that? Or was it?
I mean, it's got a scientific name, but I know it's really funny that it's called that. Like, I don't know who called it that, but yeah, I don't know.
Didn't know if it was just discovered or something. Okay, cool.
No. They've known about this thing for a long time. But yeah, I guess if it was in the 90s, like somebody must have named it that after the 90s. So I don't know.
Wonder what it was called.
I'm sure there's a story. I'm sure there's a story out there somewhere. All right. Danielle, let me guess. They live in Australia. Probably. I wouldn't doubt it. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to the next class of annelid worms. Remember, we were just looking at the class Polychaeta. We're now looking at the class Clytellata. And these are going to include two major groups, the oligochaetes and the Hirudinida, or the leeches. We're going to start with the oligochaete worms. And the oligochaete literally means few, few chaetae, so few bristles. And actually, if you look at the body of a typical oligochaete like this earthworm, you don't see those parapodia like you saw on the polychaete worms, and you also don't see any bristles with the naked eye. However, if you were to look very closely, perhaps with a microscope, you would notice that there are in fact some bristles along the external body of these animals. They're just so small that you can't see them. So that's why they're called oligochaetes. The earthworms are really the kind of the poster child here. And so most of these are soil deposit feeders. Earthworms live in sediment in soil, and they're going to consume the partially decomposed organic matter in the soil. So you can think of them as like detritivores. They're eating partially decomposed things, so dead stuff. And ecologically speaking, they're very important. They provide really important ecosystem services for humans because they help to recycle the nutrients in the soil, and that helps us grow things like crops, of course. So they're an important component of soil health. If you ever find earthworms in your garden, don't be grossed out. They're your friends. You want to have them there, you know, welcome them, and actually create a nice hospitable environment for your earthworms. Now, the name, the class Clitellata, refers to a particular anatomical structure found on these animals, and the clitellum is involved in reproduction, and it's this thing right here. So notice that there's kind of like this little band that circumvents the body of the earthworm, and that's the clitellum. And we'll see in this image how the clitellum is involved in earthworm reproduction. So earthworms are hermaphrodites, which of course, again, hermaphrodite. They are going to have both male and female structures. And I've got a little drawing here of a typical mating process of an earthworm, and it shows us the function of the clitellum. Okay, so when earthworms have sex, when they reproduce, they're going to kind of line up in opposite directions, and they're going to glue themselves to each other. And when they glue themselves to each other, they are going to be lining up their clitella with these specific anatomical structures. So notice that we've got two earthworms here. This earthworm on the top, you can see that it's got testes that are producing sperm. And it's also got an ovary just next to it that produces eggs. Also notice that just to the right of the testes, there is a seminal receptacle, which is where sperm is received and stored in the body of the earthworm. Okay, and if you look at the one on the bottom, it has those same anatomical structures. So testes, ovary, and a seminal receptacle. Okay, so now what happens when they line up with each other? The testes of one of these earthworms is going to produce sperm. Actually, both of them are going to produce sperm. And there's this tube that is going to deposit the sperm from each worm into the other's seminal receptacle. Okay, so it's like they're giving them a little sperm packet and they're holding it in this little pocket, this little seminal receptacle. Okay, now the next thing that happens is each of these worms is going to produce eggs. And so notice that there is an ovary and there's an oviduct that is going to release eggs. And those eggs get released where? They get released into this little membrane that is born from the clitellum. Okay, so remember that clitellum. The clitellum basically makes this little membrane. And that membrane holds the eggs. Okay, so once that membrane captures those eggs, what happens is it slides off the back end or the terminal end of the worm. It slides over the seminal receptacle that is holding the sperm from the other earthworm, and then it captures some of that sperm. The sperm fertilize the eggs that are being held by that membrane from the clitellum, and then it slides off the end of the worm and it makes this cute little cocoon where the fertilized eggs develop and form little baby earthworms. And eventually all the little baby earthworms will emerge from the cocoon and they will go off to live their little earthwormy lives and help us and be happy little friends of the soil. So that's how earthworms do it. The end. Any questions? Okay. Next in the class Clitellata is, oh, Eric. Eric's sharing I'm assuming that's a link to something about the bobbit worm. Okay, cool. Discovered in 1994. Awesome. So it is a pretty new species. All right, so the next group of worms in the class Clitolata is the Hirudinida, and these are also kind of scary, right? Also just in time for Halloween. These are leeches. Leeches are ectoparasites, not all of them, but many of them are ectoparasites. And actually, it's kind of a misconception that all leeches are parasites. There are many species of leeches that are scavengers, many of which are also predators. But the ones that we know of the best, because of course, they parasitize us, are the ones that are living in swamps and attach themselves to a host. Okay, notice first of all that we have this worm, and if you look at it closely, you can see the segmentation on the body. Notice that it's got two ends to it. It's got almost like two suckers, if you will. It's got jaws on the anterior end and then a posterior sucker, which it uses also to attach itself to its host. It's got, you know, gut and intestines and whatnot. Now, one of the cool things about leeches is that they produce three interesting substances that facilitate their parasitic life cycle or lifestyle. The first, and I think of them as the 3 A's. So they produce an antiseptic, which helps to clean the area that is about to be bitten. And that kind of gets rid of all the bacteria and all of the microbes that could potentially get into the leech's body as it's feeding on blood. So it's, you know, very nice and clean and sanitary. It also produces an anesthetic, very considerate. It makes an anesthetic so that it doesn't cause any pain to its host as it's sucking blood, and you might assume, oh, isn't that nice? Well, it's not really nice. It's actually advantageous because if the host doesn't notice that it's being parasitized, then it's going to have a better chance to get a nice full blood meal. So it does that to be sneaky, not to be nice. And then it produces an anticoagulant, which prevents the blood from clotting that is being given off by the host. And it just kind of keeps that blood flowing until the leech is nice and plump and full and detaches from the host and falls to the bottom of the swamp or whatever. And then it actually takes quite a long time for it to digest its blood meal. So yeah, those are leeches. And so they're really close